World War II officially started with the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, which prompted both England and France to declare war on Germany. World War II went on to become the most destructive war in human history. It made World War I look pretty easy. As you can see from this picture, bombing from the air, bombing of civilian targets became a huge part of tactics and a big reality of the total war that was World War II. This slide provides a nice review of the events that led to the war. Following the declaration of wars in early September 1939, there was a long period of calm, and this lasted for about 6 or 7 months where not much happened. So contrast that to the start of World War I, where war was declared and boom, within weeks, major battles were being fought. You had, after the Blitzkrieg on Poland, a long period of calm, several months, which came to be called the phony war. War had been declared, but nothing was happening. This led many in Europe, especially in Western Europe and England and France, etc., to get a false sense of security that maybe some kind of diplomatic solution could be had to the problems. Hope for peace. The Europeans were not eager to fight this time, at least outside of Germany, but it was not to be. In April of 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Why Norway, you ask? Oil, oil, oil. A fully industrialized economy, a fully mechanized war. They were going to need oil to complete these operations, to see their mission through, and access to resources of oil became a huge factor in this war. And so the Germans invade Norway for oil. Norway was conquered in hours. This was not a place of fierce fighting. One of what I think is the coolest stories from World War II has to do with the race to create an atomic weapon. As we talked about a couple weeks ago in class, Albert Einstein and other scientists, other physicists, had figured out in the early 20th century how to split an atom. And when I asked y'all in class, what happens when you split an atom? Boom, big explosion, lots of energy. And so it was pretty universal knowledge amongst educated people in 1930s and 1940 that whoever could harness this technology, this power, create a bomb out of it, was going to have a sizable advantage in this war. Albert Einstein had received permission from the United States to come to the U.S. as a refugee in the 1930s. He was a Jew escaping Hitler's anti-Semitic policies. And he wrote a letter to the American President Franklin Roosevelt saying, hey, here's what I know how to do, and here's what I think we can do. And as we talked about in class, he became involved in laying the foundation for establishing what became a nuclear weapon, something he came to regret. But he wasn't the only person in the world who knew how to do this. And so one of the leading nuclear physicists or atomic physicists in the world in 1940 was a Norwegian physicist. And one of the really cool side stories of World War II, which I would encourage you to investigate, is the use of intelligence, and particularly human intelligence and different kinds of technological intelligence that countries were really, for the first time, starting to harness. And the British were the best. They were the best at this. And so there was this Norwegian physicist, and the British, who weren't actively fighting the Germans yet, flew into Norway in the cover of night, landed outside this guy's home, stole him out of his bed, kidnapped him out of his bed, got him back on the plane or the helicopter or whatever they came in. I don't even know if they had helicopters yet. I don't think they did. But brought him back to England, where he was a captive of the British government for the remainder of the war. They did not want Hitler to have access to this man's knowledge, for him to be able to use the scientists for the creation of of a weapon. So pretty cool story. As you can see from these photographs, this was not a high energy invasion. This was pretty laid back. It was easy for the Germans. There was a bomb, there's some smoke happening in the background here, but the soldiers are walking in, they're riding their bikes around. Norway fell quickly and was occupied by Germany for the duration of the war. In May 1940, Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of England. Needless to say, after appeasement failed, Neville Chamberlain was out, and Churchill looked really, really smart. Remember, he was the only member of Parliament to vote against the deal at Munich from 1938. Churchill was gruff. His nickname was the Bulldog, and that had to do with his tenacity and his toughness and his ugliness. Kind of looked like a bulldog. Churchill was a British aristocrat who was pretty roundly disdained by his own class because of his rather poor manners. He was a drinker, he was a smoker, he was notoriously tough. And his toughness was a really important component of this entire war. He was also an artist and a writer. He's a Nobel Prize winning writer and artist, and he had an amazing way with words. Winston Churchill is one of the most quoted men in human history and an absolutely fascinating character. But we'll talk about his significance and the significance of his rise in British politics here in a little bit. But he became the Prime Minister of England in 1940, and he saw defeating fascism as a moral obligation. And this will be hugely, hugely important. After the invasion of Norway, Hitler recommenced his blitzkrieg into Western Europe, and the northern countries of France and Holland and Belgium and Holland were up next, and they all fell very quickly. And of course, who was going to be invaded next? France was, of course. Well, everybody likes to laugh at France's rather dismal performance in World War II. The French were amazing in World War I. They held off the Germans. They made the Schlieffen Plan fail. And especially in light of the Schlieffen Plan and what happened in World War I, the French really prepared badly for a future war with Germany in their preparations for World War II. You can see up here along their northern border on the dotted line, these were weaker fortifications, and then they built a series of very strong fortifications along the southern border with Germany, their direct border with Germany, that came to be called the Maginot Line, and it was called the Maginot Line after the general who had envisioned it. The Maginot Line was built up in France over the 1920s and the 1930s, and I'll show you some pictures of it here in a second. But here's what you need to know. When the Blitzkrieg recommenced, when the phony war was over and the Germans were coming, the French army and all of their weapons of war, their tanks, etc., were all concentrated over here along the Maginot Line. And here came the German army, woo, down through Belgium and in through the north. So it's one of the reasons things did not go so well for France. You see this? This is an impressive fortification. You see the sign on it, 1932. This was the Maginot Line, was a huge thing. Look at the men. Look at the men down here, okay? This was absolutely enormous area of fortification. It contained tunnels and other infrastructure for moving around men and supplies. It contained lines like this in open areas. And as you might guess, fortifications like that were meant to slow down or stop a tank. But the Maginot Line, for all of its planning and everything it was meant to do and how strong it was and how strongly fortified it was, simply didn't work because the Germans came in through Belgium, just like they did in World War I. Okay, so in June, late May and early June in 1940, this was the situation. Here are the French. Over here on the Maginot Line, the German army is coming into France from Belgium this way, and the British came over to France across the English Channel right here at the city of Dunkirk. Now, this left Hitler, he's right here, Hitler's right there. This left him with a decision to make. Here's Paris, relatively undefended. Here's the British army over here to his east. Here's the French army down here to his west. And very interestingly, in World War II, Hitler goes on to make what really becomes, it doesn't seem so at the time, but what really becomes a fateful decision. He ignores the British army up there on the beaches of Dunkirk. And actually, he said, get the Luftwaffe. We'll talk about their Luftwaffe was their Air Force. You know, let's kind of surround them and bring the Air Force in and drop some bombs and scare them a little bit, but they'll leave. Let's go down and take Paris. They made the very strategic decision to take Paris while it was relatively undefended. Hitler sent some troops down this way to kind of block off the French, and he sent a thin line of troops over here to block off the British, and he sent the majority of his army to capture Paris. Well, while Hitler was capturing Paris, this worked out well for him in the short term. The British army had landed at Dunkirk, and when I say army, I mean army. Several 100,000 men, more than 100,000 men had landed at Dunkirk, but now they were surrounded, and the Luftwaffe was flying over, and they risked being taken prisoner or worse, bombed. In one of what I think is one of the coolest stories of World War II, and it actually gives me goosebumps, Winston Churchill got on the radio and he ordered an evacuation of the British Army at Dunkirk. And this happened over the course of a couple of days in early June 1940. And I can just imagine, there's Churchill on the radio and he's calling out the vessels of the British Navy, every available vessel. And he got on the radio and he encouraged people who had fishing boats and pleasure boats and any kind of watercraft, cross the English Channel and evacuate the army. And the people of England responded. All of these ships crossed the English Channel, and they evacuated the army from Dunkirk. When Hitler knew that the army was being evacuated, he thought, great, now I don't need to worry about them. And the evacuation continued, and not a soldier was lost. Awesome. Awesome story. So here's the men leaving Dunkirk, leaving the beaches of Dunkirk, loading these vessels. The British left or destroyed all of their machinery, all of their equipment. They focused on saving the men. And so they really lost a lot. That was a ton to lose, and it took England a good bit of time to rebuild from this loss. But here's what Hitler underestimated, and here's the significance of Dunkirk. You know, just the response of the people coming on their boats to save these men. This is what gives me goosebumps. But here's the thing. The British Army, which could have been destroyed in 1940, was left to fight another day. And that is what makes Hitler's decision as he's coming into France so fateful. In the early days of June 1940, the French government surrendered. And so when the French are accused of rolling over in World War II, you know, they wanted to fight hard. They were in the wrong place. Maybe they shouldn't have been taken by surprise, but they really did. They made the decision to capitulate as the Nazi armies came rolling into Paris. And Hitler entered Paris in June of 1940, and he certainly made the most of the PR potential, if you will. that this had. This is an iconic photograph of Hitler and some of his henchmen standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. I do not know if this is true, but it's such an awesome story. It's worth sharing. It's a great legend, but legend has it that the wires to the elevator in the Eiffel Tower were cut the night before Hitler arrived in Paris, an act of sabotage. So he could not travel to the top of the Eiffel Tower while he was there, preventing him from doing that. It's a legend, hopefully true, but a cool story. So France was out. It's June 1940. France is out of the war. The government that was established in France was called the Vichy government, and this big yellow area of France that you see up to the north, including Paris, was occupied. That was directly occupied and controlled by the Germans. The second largest area, that is the bluish purple color, was the free area, what the Nazis called the free area. It was called the Vichy government because it was run out of the city of Vichy in France. And the leader of Vichy France was a World War I general, a very famous man named Henri Marshal Pétain. And Pétain became the leader of Free France down there. Now, for all practical purposes, the Vichy government of France during World War II was a puppet state to the Nazis. France was occupied, and France was what is called a collaborator state. They collaborated with the Nazis. They worked with the Nazis in an official capacity with the war effort and in their policies. Now, this is a part of their history that the French really struggle with, and this is really interesting to read about, because when they collaborated, France was kind of out of the war militarily, but from a government perspective, they supported the policies of the Nazis, and they supported their policies in the war and helped them in their efforts in the war. They collaborated with them, very importantly, in the efforts of the Holocaust. They had concentration camps in France. They did a major roundup of Jewish citizens in Paris in 1942. And this remains a really touchy subject in French identity and French history. And needless to say, something they struggle with. They don't necessarily like very much. But it was, in a lot of ways, it was a means to an end. France was conquered, and they had to get along. Now, while it is very fair to say that France during World War II was a state that collaborated with the Nazis, there was also a robust resistance to Nazi occupation of France. General Charles de Gaulle, who you see here, who was a very tall man, was a general in the French army, and he escaped to London after the fall of France, and from there he led what was called the Free French government, and he led the French resistance. The stories of the French resistance from World War II are endless, and they are fascinating. And the French resistance, while it was not a majority movement, is something the French hang on to with a great deal of justified pride, and it's something that did play, a marginal but significant role in the war. French resistance, and is very interested, including everything from blowing up railroad tracks to spilling big tanks of milk that were bound for the German army, to, and this is my favorite part, relabeling thousands and thousands and thousands of bottles of French wine, taking the labels from the bad bottles and putting them on the good bottles, and the labels from the good bottles and putting them on the bad bottles, so that when the Nazis stole the wine, which they stole hundreds of thousands of bottles of French wine, they would take the bad bottles thinking it was the good wine. Everything from that to hiding French treasures and French art. It was a widespread resistance. It really didn't make a huge difference in the war itself, but there was a widespread and very serious resistance to the Nazis in France during the rest of World War II. Well, after France was out, Hitler kind of looked at England and was like, okay, bye-bye, you gonna bail now too? And certainly that was the thought. And by all accounts, and what the evidence suggests, is that this was Hitler's objective. He was not interested in conquering Western Europe. He was interested in the East. His plan of Lebensraum, the living space for the master race, for the Aryan race, went to the East, and it took land in the East and enslaved the Slavic people. Hitler wanted Western Europe out. He wanted France out. He had France. All he wanted was for England to leave the war. And this looked like a great moment for England to do just that. Just to kind of say, oh gosh, all right, bye-bye, we're going to stay here and do our own thing, and y'all have fun. And this is why it's so important that Winston Churchill is the prime minister, because from just a place of personal conviction, Churchill would have never allowed that. And a lot of historians look at what happens in England early in the war, you know, everything from Dunkirk to the Battle of Britain, which we'll talk about here. And they look at Churchill and they see the significance of Churchill as an individual keeping England in the war. Even if they're not making a huge impact right now or yet, they will. And so one of the significant events of the war is the Battle of Britain in August of 1940. And this is very commonly called the Blitz. Blitzkrieg, Hitler's Blitzkrieg had worked beautifully so far. And this is the Blitz. Again, think of a defense blitzing a quarterback, sacking him, forcing him to lose tons of yards, etc. Throwing everything at him. We're throwing everything at him. This is an interesting battle for a number of reasons. It was fought across the month of August into early September of 1940. And this was a battle that was fought in the air. It was not a land battle. This was a battle between air forces, planes that dogfought each other in the sky, and planes that dropped bombs on civilian and military targets. So this is a battle between the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Air power had improved dramatically between World War I and World War II, and the capability and the use of planes was greatly increased, and the number of planes that were involved was greatly increased. So the gist of the Battle of Britain is, for about a month, Hitler bombed the city of London and outlying areas. Just think for a second what your life would be like if the city you lived in was being bombed every day and every night. It would be hugely annoying, to say the least, and incredibly dangerous. And this was the situation for the citizens of London. You can see here a fire brigade putting out fires after a part of London had been bombed. Look at the smoke from the bombs rising behind the Tower Bridge of London. You can see the Tower of London also in the background. I think this is one of the most amazing photographs I have ever seen. Look at the whole front of this building falling. It's absolutely incredible. So this was a terrible, terrible moment for England, but looking back on it now, this was also one of their finest moments. Churchill went on the radio. Remember the radio and how it had come about after World War I. Churchill went on the radio every day. And here's a man whose one of his greatest gifts is words. And he encouraged the people of London to hang in there, to stick it out, that this was their obligation, this was their duty, this was how they could be great patriots, and they could do something great for their country, and they were being asked to sacrifice. But he encouraged them to stick it out, to keep going about their daily lives to the best of their ability, and in the meantime, do the things that they needed to do. And the citizens of London responded. Here's a group of people sleeping in a tube station underground. It was a great bomb shelter. They sent their children away, and one of the most moving stories from the Blitz, people who lived in the countryside outside of London opened their home to the children of London, and families entrusted these people they didn't know. They put their children on trains and they sent them out to the countryside to the hospitality of families that they didn't know, who took good care of them. And if you are a fan of the Chronicles of Narnia, in the story The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you've ever wondered why the Pevensie children were at the home of the professor, now you know. And needless to say, the citizens responded. They formed brigades. They protected London's ancient treasures, the Cathedral of St. Paul, Westminster Abbey, etc. And they endured. And after about a month, Hitler gave up the cause. He figured out he wasn't going to succeed. And so he turned his attention elsewhere. Very famously, Winston Churchill, giving his famous V for Victory sign here, said, "Never in the course of human history was so much owed by so many to so few. So many, the people of England, so few, the pilots of the RAF, who really were incredibly courageous defenders of England in the air." Also, the British made great use of this secret little tool they had perfected and used with great success during the Battle of Britain, called radar. The Germans were absolutely so frustrated and flabbergasted by the part that the Royal Air Force always seemed to know when they were coming. And indeed they did, but they didn't figure it out until after the battle. So England hung in there to fight another day. In June of 1941, so after the Battle of Britain, things were pretty quiet for about 6 more months. In June of 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. This ends up being a rather fateful decision as well. But of course he invaded the Soviet Union. What about that non-aggression pact, you ask? Well, what about it? Everybody knew that that was not going to last, including Joseph Stalin. He was not stupid. He knew there was no way Hitler wasn't coming for him. Everybody had read Mein Kampf. You know, it was all about the East. And so everyone knew to anticipate this invasion. It was simply a matter of when, and the non-aggression pact was simply a matter of Joseph Stalin buying time. Well, in June 1941, to the surprise of really no one, Hitler invades the Soviet Union and Russia is brought into the war. Now, Hitler was a great fan of Napoleon. Napoleon had almost conquered the entire continent of Europe. But Hitler thought he could best Napoleon, that he could invade Russia successfully. And he was darn near right. You can see here on this map how the Germans go in, and their plan is to take care of all this before old General Winter gets a hold of them, because the Russian strategy is just to wait for winter. And so they thought they were going to be too smart and too fast for that. And of course, what they have and Napoleon didn't have were railroads and airplanes and all kinds of good things like that. However, Russia was still Russia, and it didn't have the infrastructure that the Western Europe did, even at this time. And invading Russia was difficult, and it took an incredible amount of time and an incredible amount of manpower. These rivers, like the one you see here, there were many of them, and bridges had to be built across them for the German army to be able to cross. Look at all the horses in this picture. They had to rely on horses and oxen and other beasts of burden to do a lot of the heavy lifting in Russia, and that's very telling. That's very telling that the horse was an important tool of the trade, of technology there. But still, they advanced far, and they advanced rather quickly. And in another one of his very fateful decisions, Hitler's army came to within sighting distance of Moscow. They could see the towers and the buildings of Moscow, and they decided that they would go somewhere else. They would go to Stalingrad instead, and they didn't take Moscow, and that ended up to be a very fateful decision, again, that Hitler had made in the war. They turned themselves, the army, towards Stalingrad, and we'll look at that battle a little bit later on. The Soviet army advanced in front of the Russian army. This is an old Soviet tactic. You draw the invading army into the interior of the country, and then you wait for winter to do its work. And so many thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken POWs as prisoners of war. Many Russian peasants were also forced to flee their homes. And they were forced to flee their homes in advance of the invading German army, but they were forced to flee by the Russian army because the Russian army enforced a scorched earth policy. So millions of Russians were affected by this. They lost their homes and they lost everything. The scorched earth policy is what it sounds like, and this is a very Russian thing. Scorched earth means that you are going to destroy any aspect of shelter or sustenance in the path of an invading army. You are going to give them any means of sustenance or comfort. Homes were burned down, crops were destroyed, livestock were killed. And so what that means is that the Russian citizens lost their homes, lost their food, lost their livestock. But that was beside the point. The Russians couldn't have it, but neither could the Germans. And so for many months in 1941, the German armies pushed further and further into Russia, and a crisis evolved in Russia because of the scorched earth policy. In December of 1941, the United States entered the war. Winston Churchill had been begging the American president every day, called him every day, and told him he needed to get involved in this fight, that they needed to defeat fascism. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, he was sympathetic. He saw fascism as a great danger, and by all evidence, he really thought the U.S. needed to be involved in the war, but there just wasn't the stomach for it. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, the third fascist power in the Triple Axis, bombed Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii. And so the United States was in the war. They declared war on Japan the same day. They declared war on Germany December 8th, 1941, and the U.S. was in. And Roosevelt was able to use this moment to persuade the American Congress and American people that they really needed to take care of Hitler first and focus on him first. And this is where World War II really becomes a world war, because there's this huge Atlantic theater or European theater of war and the Pacific theater. And you'll learn about the Pacific theater in U.S. history next year. In the Atlantic, Hitler and Roosevelt made the strategic decision to invade Africa first. Now, this sounds kind of weird, and I have to tell you, Joseph Stalin was not impressed with this idea in 1942. He's like, hey, I'm dealing with this whole German army beating up my country and my people. And Roosevelt and Churchill were like, yeah, we're coming, but you see our plan here. We're going to weaken them, okay? We're going to weaken them. We're going to sweep them out of northern Africa, where the Italians had sent in tons of soldiers, and the Germans as well. We're going to sweep them out of there, and then we'll deal with Europe. So this is Operation Torch, 1942, and this is how the Allied powers, beginning in December of 1941, are the United States, England, and Russia. They invade northern Africa, where the Germans and the Italians have taken over a lot of the cities on the coast and things like that. The German general in northern Africa was a guy named Erwin Rommel, and he was known as the Desert Fox. He was actually a great strategic mind and a great general. But the Germans didn't commit a lot of resources to northern Africa. So this is mainly the Italians there, and they were the Italians. They weren't as good of fighters as the Germans. And so Rommel had his hands full because the British and the Americans really threw kind of a lot at him. The British General Bernard Montgomery, the American General George Patton, Working together over the course of about a year, they essentially chased the Germans east to west across the Sahara Desert of the north and forced their surrender at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. If you have never seen the movie Casablanca, Casablanca is a city in Morocco, and it is set in Morocco in World War II. You should totally see it because it's awesome. Following the surrender of the Germans at El Alamein and the defeat of the Nazis in North Africa, the Big Three, as they came to be called, there's Stalin on the left, Roosevelt in the middle, and Churchill on the right, met at Tehran in Iran for their first of several meetings to discuss the course of the war. Now, this is 1943. Stalin's big complaint was that the Americans and the British were goofing around in North Africa when he had the bulk of the German army tearing up his land and his people in Russia. He wanted a Western front. Roosevelt and Churchill patted him on the head, told him it was coming. Be patient, Joe. And he was, but begrudgingly so. The most important decision that was made at Tehran, however, was that the Big Three, the Allied powers, England, the United States, and Russia, were in this fight until the end. The most important decision made at Tehran was that they were going to fight until unconditional surrender. There was not going to be an armistice this time. They weren't going to mess around with that. They were going to fight until unconditional surrender. So the foundation stone of the lasting peace, and here's Hitler and his Third Reich down, and they're going to get smushed by this. Most historians consider the Battle of Stalingrad in Russia, of course, to be the turning point of the war in Europe. It's very interesting to me that this battle was over by the time the Big Three met in Tehran in 1943. So remember, Hitler decided to turn from Moscow, which the Russians ended up essentially burning down anyway. And he turned his attention to Stalingrad instead, and so he sends his army down there. And this battle was absolutely brutal, but it ends up being a turning point in the war. It's a big victory for the Russians. The Germans camped out essentially outside the city of Stalingrad over the winter of 1942 to 1943. They had encircled the city and they were laying siege to it. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. And so the winter gave way to the spring. The Germans were hungry. They had lost men to exposure. And now it's springtime, and they were literally stuck in the mud. The Russians, in the meantime, put forward a fierce propaganda campaign calling out the residents of Stalingrad, just like Churchill had done with London, that they needed to hang in there, and buddy, they needed to fight. They needed to deal with it. So here's the brave Russian soldier who is attacking the very rat-like looking Hitler in the cartoon and defending Russia from the likes of him. Here's the strong soldier holding off the Nazi tank at the city of Stalingrad. And so this became a battle of kind of hand-to-hand combat, and became a battle of siege. And the city of Stalingrad essentially was destroyed. Here's some Russian snipers in the battle, but look at the home, look at the level of destruction that existed. Soldiers running across. Just again, the level of destruction is absolutely amazing. And so hundreds of thousands of German soldiers are laying siege to this city. And so they had most of the city encircled over the winter of 1942 to 1943. They were bombing the city with airplanes. But what happened was that the Russian army came, and in the early spring, a contingent of the Red Army was inside the city and was defending the city, but another portion of the army encircled the German army outside of the city. And so the Germans found themselves surrounded and they surrendered. You can see here the surrender at Stalingrad. Now, at the time, it was really hard to understand how big of a deal this was. But as I think Mr. Spielvogel says, and I've read other historians say, this breaks the back of the German army. They lost hundreds of thousands of men to POWs and to casualties of war. They lost hundreds of tanks, airplanes, etc. So the Russian victory here has a huge impact. And what happens as a consequence of Stalingrad is that the Russians go off defense and they start playing offense. So after Stalingrad, the German army is in retreat and the Russian army is chasing them. And Stalin was pissed. This war took a terrible toll on Russia, not only because of the Germans, but because of the scorched earth policy. And of 55 million casualties worldwide to World War II, including victims of the Holocaust, more than 20 million of them were Russian. And so Russia bore a huge cost in this war. And that's why Russia was like, there's Stalin. This is why Stalin was like, open up a Western front. Come on, man, you're killing me. And he was frustrated with Churchill and Roosevelt, who were always getting ready for this invasion and never seemed to be carrying it out. Well, this was not the time in Roosevelt and Churchill's estimation for opening up a Western front. And so they decided to invade Italy. Stalin was not impressed. But in July of 1943, they invaded Italy. So they have knocked the Nazis out in North Africa, and now they're going into Italy through Sicily, and they're going to go up the boot. They're going to get the Italians out of the war. And this battle, this invasion of Italy, this is not a war in which the success of the Allies was ever in question. The Italian armies just simply were not competent enough to successfully fight the American and British soldiers. But this was a difficult battle. The geography of Italy is incredibly mountainous, has all these small medieval villages and towns that had to be cleared. It was just a slog, and there were a lot of casualties incurred by the Allied forces as they made their way through Italy. And the Germans had to back up the Italian soldiers to a certain extent, which irritated them because they were trying to defeat the Russians. And here's some pictures just to kind of show you how things went in Italy. It was just a hard fight, and it took a long time. Many of the towns and villages and cities in Italy are so old. They go back to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. And so clearing them of Nazis was difficult. You can see the kind of circumstances the Allied soldiers had to fight in. Central Italy is incredibly mountainous, and so you can see here at this landing, and this is actually a picture from the amphibious landing on Sicily, that just the geography was difficult for the Allies to deal with. Here they come marching through Pompeii, the ruins of Pompeii. And so Allied success in Italy was never in question, but this was a hard fight, and it was kind of a slog. It just took a long time. It was difficult, and there were a lot of casualties that were incurred. But eventually, the Allied armies arrived in Rome, and this was in early June 1944. Mussolini surrendered. His people turned on him immediately. They greeted the Allied soldiers with joy. They turned on Mussolini. He was handed over to the Allies, but it was the Italian people, his own people, who hanged him. He had his body dragged through the streets, taken down from hanging. It was dragged through the streets behind a Jeep. And then this is Mussolini and one of his right-hand men. Their bodies were left to the stray dogs of the city. And Italy surrendered June 5th, 1944, one day before the very famous Allied invasion of Normandy.